According to Christian Wildberg, Corpus Hermeticum 3 is really two texts in one. In order to understand this tractate, these two texts must be pried apart by modern editors. The first text, he says, is a short but coherent hermetic account of the genesis of our universe. The second is a set of almost equally coherent comments that are unfortunately written in a quote-unquote pompous and barely grammatical style. The first text was written by a hermetist propagating an entirely positive and optimistic view of a world created for the unchanging enjoyment and appreciation of mankind. The second text, a set of marginal notes, was written by someone who thought that the original Hermetic creation story was inaccurate or incomplete in several respects. His prose was stilted, says Vilberg, and he had a predilection for big words. Indeed, he calls him barely literate, a barely literate astrologer, because he had astrological interests. Now, at some point, a man in Antiquity who owned the Hermetic text with the marginal notes hired, says Vilberg, a non-Hermetic scribe who had little or no idea what he was asked to copy. And in order to make a clean copy of the text, the scribe, again, according to Vilberg, mechanically and even thoughtlessly copied the marginal notes into the main text of the tractate. This act of simultaneous copying and corruption happened at an early date, prior to the transmission of the Hermetica in the Middle Ages. Now, another term for a marginal note is a gloss, and the one who makes the gloss is called a glossator. The glossators who made the marginal notes, according to Vilberg, might not have been Hermetic practitioners, just interested readers of the Hermetica. Their notes are not necessarily complete sentences, and they don't always agree in content with the initial text. So, Vilberg's process is to go in and to repair the text by removing the individual words, phrases, and sometimes whole paragraphs, which he identifies as marginal notes. And he bases his procedure on what he thinks are philological principles. That is, he tries to make his decisions based on the grammar and the logic of the text. He goes on the hunt for what he perceives to be errors or irregularities of logic, expression, and syntax. In the case of Corpus Hermeticum 3, Vilberg takes it as clear evidence of a historical fact that Hermetism developed in antiquity and that the original tractates were appropriated and altered, again, as he says, by men who had their own idiosyncratic ideas that may or may not have counted as genuinely Hermetic at the time, evidently sometime in late antiquity. But in fact, Vilberg goes further. He claims that the worldviews of the original author of Corpus Hermeticum 3 and the glossator are radically different. The original author bore witness to an enchanted and benign universe, whereas the glossator evokes a much darker and dangerous world in which humankind is oppressed by fate. And according to this glossator, humanity can only hope to liberate itself from fate by means of astrology. Astrology is the foundation of human ingenuity and culture, as well as humanity's extraordinary power to shield itself against fate. Vilberg removes all of this astrological material from the text because he considers it to be originally part of a set of marginal notes. Effectively, then, he de-astrologizes the text of Corpus Hermeticum 3 and then goes on to remove the astrological material in other tractates as well. Just to show you guys how this works, I'm going to give you the translation of Corpus Hermeticum 3, A Sacred Discourse of Hermes, translated by Brian Copenhaver, and I'm going to show you how Christian Vilberg modifies the text by his method. So, in the first passage, it's virtually the same, that God is the glory of all things, as also are the divine and the divine nature. God, as well as mind and nature and matter, is the beginning of all things that are sense. He is wisdom meant to show them forth. The divine is also a beginning, and it is nature and energy and necessity and completion and renewal. In Copenhaver, the text continues that in the deep there was a boundless darkness and water and fine intelligent spirit, here pneuma, all existing by divine power in chaos. Then a holy light was sent forth and elements solidified. Noticing some sort of gap here, he's taking out something from the text. The elements solidified out of liquid essence and all the gods. Now he's signaling that something is not making sense. And he's putting it in curly brackets. All the gods, something that doesn't make sense, of germinal nature. Okay, so how does Christian Vilberg modify this text? Well, he does two things. So he puts back into the translation what was already there in the manuscripts and which editors took out. And that's the phrase beneath the sediment. And then he cuts out the what's in curly brackets, what doesn't make any sense, divide the parts, and he moves of germinal nature to another place of the sentence. But what he considers to be a marginal note is this short phrase, and all the gods. So that gets put to the right. The next passage for Copenhaver is basically without any problems, and Vilberg doesn't modify it. So I'll just read it. While all was unlimited and unformed, light elements were set apart to the heights, and the heavy were grounded in the moist sand, the whole of them delimited by fire and raised aloft to be carried by pneuma or spirit. And then the heavens appeared in 7 circles, the gods became visible in the shapes of stars and all their constellations, and the arrangement of this lighter substance corresponded to the gods contained in it. The periphery rotated in the air, carried in a circular course, all by divine spirit, of course. And here the modification that Vilberg makes is he recognizes or proposes that this phrase, the gods became visible in the shapes of the stars, that is a marginal note, and that comes from the astrological editor, so he moves that aside. And proceeding to section 3, through his own power, each god sent forth what was assigned to him, and here we have some major changes introduced by Wildberg. Basically, he sees the entire next paragraph as all an interpolation from the margin, and so he moves it over to the margin, namely the material about the beasts, all kinds of animals and plants germinating, and as well as this phrase that, according to Copenhaver, doesn't really make sense, so he puts it in curly brackets. According to Copenhaver, we have the next passage being about how the gods sowed, even though that's a problematic phrase, how the gods sowed the generations of humans to know the works of God, to be a working witness to nature, to increase the number of mankind. And then this phrase, to master all things under heaven, that piques Vilberg's interests because that sounds like an astrological sort of comment. So he takes out that phrase, to master all things under heaven, as well as the next little phrase, to discern the things that are good, and then he connects the 2 sentences about the multiplication of human beings and sort of joins them together. So in Copenhaver's translation, we continue through the wonder-working course of the cycling gods, They created every soul incarnate to contemplate heaven, the course of the heavenly gods, the works of God, and the working of nature. Now, this entire paragraph is very problematic for Wildberg. So he takes out that entire paragraph and says that it's a marginal gloss. And this means that the purpose for humanity is just to multiply and to very simply examine the things that are good. Even this next phrase, to know divine power, which is a pretty bland phrase, and the whirling changes of fair and foul, he takes out as also by the glossator, and leaving in only this final phrase, to discover every means of working skillfully with the things that are good. Of course, he has his own way of rendering this. This is only Copenhaver's translation. This next section of text is probably the most difficult, and it's one of the reasons that Vilberg thinks that it's mostly an interpolation. For them, this is the beginning of the virtuous life and of wise thinking as far as the course of the cycling gods, again, another reference to the stars, destines it. And it's also the beginning of their release to what will remain of them after they have left great monuments on earth in the works of industry and the fame of seasons. The text becomes very problematic here. They will become dim. To Wildberg, this is why he calls the glossator barely literate, because this whole section really doesn't make a whole lot of sense, even if they are just a series of random notes connected together. So in accordance with his method, he takes out this paragraph entirely and moves it to the margin, only preserving this final statement that from every birth of ensouled flesh, from the sowing of crops. As for this next bit in Copenhaver's text, it really does not make a whole lot of sense, and he's already signifying that by what's in the curly brackets. It's not really clear to me how he gets this phrase, what is diminished. But anyway, this will be renewed by necessity and by the renewal that comes from the gods and by the course of nature's measured cycle. Here, Vilberg really doesn't do too much. He removes what's in the curly brackets, takes out the filler, and just has a different translation for what is the final paragraph here. The entire cosmic admixture, as he says, is divine and renewed by nature, and nature has been established in the divine. So since I'm not authorized to give you Wildberg's translation, I'm going to give you Copenhaver's translation again, but using Wildberg's methods with things taken out mostly, but a few things added in. God is the glory of all things, as also are the divine and the divine nature. God, as well as mind and nature and matter, is the beginning of all things that are, since he is wisdom, meant to show them forth. The divine is also a beginning, and it is nature and energy and necessity and completion and renewal. In the deep there was boundless darkness and water and fine intelligent spirit, all existing by divine power in chaos. Then a holy light was sent forth, and the elements of a germinal nature solidified beneath the sediment. While all was unlimited and unformed, light elements were set apart to the heights, and the heavy were grounded in the moist sand, the whole of them delimited by fire and raised aloft to be carried by spirit. The heavens appeared in 7 circles and all their constellations, and the arrangement of this lighter substance corresponded to the gods contained in it. The periphery rotated in the air, carried in a circular course by divine spirit. Through his own power each god sent forth what was assigned to him, the generations of humans to know the works of God, to be a working witness to nature, to increase the number of mankind, to increase by increasing and multiply by multiplying, to examine the things that are good, and to discover every means of working skillfully with things that are good. From every birth of ensouled flesh, from the sowing of crops, will be renewed by necessity and by the renewal that comes from the gods and by the course of nature's measured cycle. The entire cosmic admixture, renewed by nature, is what is divine, and nature has been established in the divine as well. Accordingly, Corpus Hermeticum 3 is a fine illustration of Wildberg's philological method. This method can only be described as interventionist. Vilberg goes against the grain of most text criticism in the past generation or so. The dominant tendency at present is to reject the previous inclination to offer a whole range of ingenious emendations to ancient texts. Instead, the dominant impulse today is to try to make sense of the texts as they stand in the manuscripts. Scholars today, including Wildberg, realize that there are hundreds of cases in which an emendation made a century ago now no longer seems necessary. Vilberg does not present himself as an emendator, but the fact is he is proposing that we make changes to the text of the Corpus Hermeticum, changes that are more radical than anything that has been suggested before, even by the most interventionist editors of the past. Moreover, Vilberg himself continues to propose more traditional emendations, since he thinks that when the marginal notes were effectively sewn into the initial text, small changes were made to the initial text in order to integrate those notes. And these smaller changes also need to be repaired. Now, in order to understand Vilberg's decisions to remove a word or a phrase or a paragraph, one must read his notes very carefully in order to see why he made those choices. But to read his notes, one must know Greek and know it pretty well. The general non-Greek reading public who reads Vilberg's translated text without pursuing his notes and introductions will only hastily conclude that they have something more reliable than the standard Greek text produced by Knock and Vestigier in the 20th century and translated by Copenhagen later in the 20th century. Suffice it to say that I remain cautious about several of the words, sentences, and clauses that Vilberg has decided, quite literally, to marginalize in his text, but it is useful that what he considers to be marginal notes in his translation, he literally moves to the margins. And to be clear, I think that Vilberg is right in many places. But in other places, it's not clear whether we are really able to identify and to dislodge a marginal note without actually having a manuscript in front of us that attests a text prior to when this supposed note was integrated. Vilberg has made a lot of decisions that he presents as objective, but that are in fact subjective. I consider philology to be a discipline, even a science, but it's a soft science, and other experts in Greek grammar will inevitably disagree with Vilberg's judgments, not to mention all those other experts in the Hermetica. So let's just take one example from Corpus Hermeticum 3, as it was known prior to Vilberg. Here we find the creation of humankind joined with the creation of four-footed, crawling, water-dwelling, winged creatures, along with germinating seed, grass, and every flowering plant. Now, Vilberg claims that the original author of the Tractate was mainly interested in the creation of humankind. Thus, he says, there is no reason to believe that plants or animals were ever mentioned in the original text. They were, as is typical of Hermetism, in Vilberg's view, of no concern. Now here, interestingly, Vilberg is not using philological principles to remove the animals and plants from the text. He is using his background knowledge of Hermetism, and Hermetism, according to Vilberg, shows little to no interest in animals and plants. What happened, says Vilberg, is that a glossiter, that same barely literate astrologer, apparently, was familiar with the biblical creation story and therefore added in the animals and the plants in somewhat biblical sounding language. And that's why Wildberg removes the animals and plants from the original creation story. Now, Wildberg may in fact be right, but I find his procedure, at least here, actually to be somewhat dubious, and I'm sure that some people in the future will object to his understanding of Hermetism as excluding interests in animals and plants, and thus to the method of removing material based on that prior or pre-understanding. All this being said, I want to emphasize that Vilberg is an excellent scholar and his methods are rigorous, but I find that overall he does not sufficiently acknowledge his subjectivity. And his subjectivity is accentuated in cases where he himself can't decide whether something that he prints in italics as probably a marginal note should be actually put in the margin. He leaves this to the reader to decide, and this is politely democratic, but this procedure raises those lingering questions about which part of the text is genuine. And this problem is only accentuated in the Poimandres, where Vilberg tells us that the editing job has been carried out so thoroughly and so skillfully that it's nearly impossible to discern different hands that have intervened and made notes in the text. I think overall, a simple, more honest, and frank recognition of scholarly subjectivity is in order. It seems to me that Vilberg felt that he had proved his case philologically about the mechanical scribal errors in tractates like Corpus Hermeticum 3, and then he went on the hunt for marginal notes in other Hermetic tractates. But as we see in Corpus Hermeticum 7, he couldn't find any marginal notes integrated there. And so basically in his translation, he puts nothing in the margin. In other cases, such as Corpus Hermeticum 18, Wildberg has radically changed the nature and meaning of the Hermetic tractate by putting large chunks of the tractate in the margin. If his results are accepted, the Corpus Hermeticum and how we read it will forever be changed. And I encourage everyone to engage critically with this new generation, this new wave of Hermetic scholarship.